You were blatantly lied to about the date of birth of the main cathedral in Petersburg. What has been portrayed to us for years as the construction of the century crumbles at the first glance at the map of the year 1800. Why does a documentary cartographer depict a building that supposedly does not exist? Why is the preceding church referred to as modest, despite being portrayed in paintings with the same gigantic dimensions as the modern cathedral? And where has the enormous obelisk from the square gone, which was recorded by all the artists of that time? We are told about the genius of building from scratch by a serf autodidact. But the facts scream that the building was simply legitimized with a new story fabricated for it. The main question is, who actually built this structure, and why has its true purpose been hidden for 200 years? Open a map of St. Petersburg dated 1800. Take a magnifying glass. Find Nevsky Prospect, the main artery of the city. Now pay attention to the drawing by the artist Benjamin Patterson, the very Patterson who documented views of Petersburg sketched from life, capturing reality. In his drawing you see Kazan Cathedral, a majestic building with a colonnade of 96 columns, a massive dome, a portico, and grand entrances. The details are carefully rendered, every column, every curve of the dome, every sculpture on the pediment. Remember this drawing. Note the date, 1800. Now open any reference book on the architectural history of St. Petersburg. Find the section on the Kazan Cathedral. Read it carefully. Construction began in 1801. The architect was Andrei Nikiforovich Voronikhin. The work was completed in 1811. The interior was finished by 1829. Calculate it yourself. Patterson draws the building in 1800. The competition for the cathedral project is announced in 1801. Voronikhin is chosen as the architect also in 1801. Up until that point, there is no project. There are no drawings. There are no sketches. The decision to construct is only being discussed. So where did Patterson get a ready-made building a year before the work began? The most obvious explanation is that the artist saw sketches of the future project. He was shown the blueprints, and he drew how the cathedral would look. This version sounds reasonable until you start asking questions. Why draw an imaginary building on a documentary map of a real city? Patterson is neither a fantasist nor a dreamer. He is a cartographer, a documentary artist. His task is to show what exists, not what will be. If there is a cathedral in his drawing, it means that the cathedral stood there. But officially, on this site stood the Church of the Nativity of the Blessed Virgin Mary. It was built by architect Mikhail Zemtsov and consecrated in the year 1737. It stood for over 60 years. In it was kept the miraculous Kazan icon. Princes and princesses were married there. Archbishops served there. So Patterson was supposed to draw a church, but he is drawing a cathedral. This is not a mistake. It's the first crack in the official version. And if you pull on this thread, the entire history of the Kazan Cathedral will start to unravel. Because the cathedral had already been standing since 1800, they didn't start to build it. They began to legitimize it, to invent an architect, dates, history, to transform a real ancient building into a replica of the 19th century. Why? To hide who actually built it and when. And now let's take a closer look at the very church that reportedly stood before the Kazan Cathedral. Open the official website of the Kazan Cathedral. In the History section, find the description of its predecessor, the Church of the Nativity of the Virgin Mary. Read the text carefully. Pay attention to one word that the authors use repeatedly: modest. Modest church. Modest dimensions. Modest decor. 3 times in one paragraph. Modest, modest, modest. Historians don't repeat this word for nothing. They are trying to instill an image in you. A small church, a provincial building, nothing remarkable, just an ordinary parish church. Remember this image. Now take a look at the painting, the interior of the Church of the Nativity of the Virgin, a painting by an unknown master from the Fabricius collection, dated to the years 1733 to 1737. That is, it was created immediately after the construction or during the finishing touches. The artist captures reality. What do you see? The ceiling height is at least 12 meters, perhaps 15. It's difficult to measure accurately from the painting, but the scale is obvious. A double row of columns made of pink marble, powerful pylons supporting the arches, multi-layered paintings on the ceiling, biblical scenes, angels, ornaments, intricate stucco work, an iconostasis that reaches up to the dome itself. And now the main point. Look at the people. The figures of the worshippers, drawn at the base of the columns to convey scale. They look like ants, tiny silhouettes against the backdrop of gigantic pylons. If a person who is 1.70 meters tall occupies 1 centimeter on the painting, then the column measures 7. Therefore, the height of the column is 12 meters. This is the height of a 4-story building. Do you call this a humble church? The Church of the Nativity of the Virgin was officially built in 4 years, from 1733 to 1737. The Kazan Cathedral was built over 10 years, from 1801 to 1811. Logic suggests that if the church was built 2.5 times faster, it should be 2.5 times smaller. But compare the proportions. Compare the figures of the people in both paintings, of the church and the cathedral. The scale is the same. The height of the ceilings is the same. The number of columns is different, but the columns themselves are of the same size. That doesn't happen. The modest church accommodated as many people as the grand cathedral. And this is not just a parish church for Sunday services. This church hosted state ceremonies of the highest rank. In the year 1739, 2 years after its construction, the Church of the Nativity of the Virgin witnessed the wedding of Princess Anna Leopoldovna, the same Anna who was born with the name Elizabeth Katharina Christine of Mecklenburg-Schwerin, a German princess who became the regent of the Russian Empire for the infant emperor Ivan VI. She was married off to Prince Anton Ulrich of Brunswick-Lüneburg, another German, a Protestant who converted to Orthodox Christianity solely for the sake of marriage. A dynastic union intended to strengthen the position of the Holstein faction at the Russian court. Remember this detail. Germans are married in a Russian church, but not in just any church. In those times, royal marriages took place only in the main cathedrals of the capital. The Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg was for emperors. The Assumption Cathedral in Moscow was for particularly important ceremonies. Ordinary parish churches, even beautiful ones, were not used for such rituals. That would have been in poor taste, an affront to the dynasty, a disregard for traditions. But Anna was married in the Church of the Nativity of the Virgin Mary, on Nevsky Prospect, in that very modest little church. So, the church had the status of a cathedral. This means it was large enough and important for state ceremonies. Therefore, the word modest is a lie, a linguistic trick, a way to diminish the significance of what cannot be completely hidden. Marriage documents remain. Paintings remain. But one can twist the interpretation, calling a magnificent cathedral a modest church. And in 150 years, no one will check. No one will compare sizes. No one will ask the question, where did that huge temple go, if a new one of the same size was built in its place? Historians usually say that the church is referred to as modest because by the end of the 18th century, it had fallen into disrepair. The facades were crumbling, the roof was leaking, and the interior decor had become dilapidated. Emperor Paul I found this church unworthy of the capital, and he ordered a new, more majestic cathedral to be built in its place. All right, the logic is clear. But then answer the question, why is the main shrine, the Kazan icon of the Mother of God, being moved to a dilapidated building? This miraculous icon, before which emperors prayed, carried in processions, and considered the protector of the city, is it really being transferred to a shabby church with a leaking roof? Why are archiepiscopal services still held in this dilapidated church? The higher church officials could not serve in just any temple. Specific conditions were required: space, decor, acoustics. If the church were falling apart, the services would have been moved elsewhere. Yet they were held there. Why is the dilapidated temple not closed for repairs? Why isn't it preserved? Why aren't they at least trying to patch the roof? No, it is used, intensively, for the most important state ceremonies. This doesn't add up. The version about the church's dilapidation is yet another excuse. The church did not fall apart. It stood strong. Its existence simply contradicted the legend that the Kazan Cathedral was built from scratch in the early 19th century. Thus, the church was downplayed. It was called modest, described as dilapidated. So that, in contrast, the new cathedral would appear more majestic. What if it's actually the same building? Think about it. In one place stands a huge temple, which is called a church. Royal personages are married there. Miraculous icons are kept there. The main services of the city are held there. Then this temple is supposedly demolished, and in its place, a precisely identical temple is built in 10 years, of the same size, in the same style, with the same functions. Or do they just renovate it, change the name, and declare it a new building? Cover operation. An old building of unknown origin is legalized through fictitious construction. They invent an architect, a serf who has no biography and no one to verify his qualifications. They carry out cosmetic renovations, plastering the walls, gilding the dome, and changing the iconostasis. They inaugurate it with great ceremony, and they write it into history as a new construction. The Zemtsov Church and the Kazan Cathedral of Voronikhin are two names for one building. The first name covered the period from 1737 to 1801. The second, from 1811 to the present. But what was there before 1737? Before Zemtsov? They don't talk about it. Because the answer to this question would destroy the entire official chronology of the city. Now let's move on to the main character of this story, the man who supposedly built the Kazan Cathedral, a serf peasant who had no engineering education and created the world's first large dome made of wrought iron. Before the technologies for steel production and the methods for calculating such structures were invented, Andrei Nikiforovich Voronikhin, born presumably in 1759. Presumably because there is no exact date. He was born as a serf of the Stroganov counts. In his childhood, he showed abilities in drawing. The Stroganovs recognized his talent and provided the boy with a basic education. From 1777 to 1779, 2 years, Voronikhin studied in Moscow under architects Vasily Bazhanov and Matvey Kazakov. 2 years. That is the entirety of his architectural education. No university, no academy, no internships abroad. 2 years as an apprentice to Moscow architects. Bazhanov and Kazakov were more artists than engineers themselves. They designed buildings, but the structural calculations were done by other specialists. Roofs, vaults, foundations, these are the work of construction engineers. An architect draws a beautiful picture. An engineer calculates whether this picture can withstand loads and if it won't collapse on people's heads. Voronikhin studied drawing with them, pencils, proportions, perspective, perhaps a bit of theory, orders, styles, the history of architecture, but no higher mathematics, no material resistance, no engineering mechanics. Then he returned to the Stroganovs. He worked as an artist, designing interiors and drawing furniture sketches. The Stroganovs appreciated him. In 1786, they even released him, freed him from serfdom. Although this was officially called a redemption, Voronikhin essentially bought his freedom from the owners for a huge sum. Where did a former serf get such money? The Stroganovs provided it to him. So, in effect, they simply gifted him his freedom. Why? It's more convenient to control a person who is formally free but is entirely dependent on you financially and socially. A former serf without connections, without money, without a place in society. The perfect puppet. In the year 1801, a competition is announced for the design of Kazan Cathedral. Renowned architects participate: Cameron, Thomas de Thoman, Quarengi, individuals with European education, names, and experience in significant projects. Voronikhin wins. A former serf who is 42 years old, has 2 years of education from 30 years ago, and experience in furniture design, wins a competition against masters of architecture. How is this possible? The official version is that Count Stroganov, the patron of Voronikhin, was on the jury of the competition. He used his influence. He pushed his protégé through. Nepotism, favoritism, cronyism, call it what you will. In the Russian Empire of the early 19th century, this was the norm. Talent meant less than connections. All right, let's assume Voronikhin got the contract through connections. But what happens next? You actually need to build the structure, design the constructions, calculate the loads, organize the construction, manage hundreds of workers, control the quality of materials and work. This is no longer favoritism. This is engineering. And if a person does not master engineering, the building will collapse. Or it will be crooked, or it will leak, or it will develop cracks. But the Kazan Cathedral stands. It has stood for 200 years. It has survived floods, wars, and the siege of Leningrad. In 1944, when the city was bombed every day, the cathedral's roof suffered more than 1,500 punctures from shell fragments. 1,500 holes. The roofing turned into a sieve, but the dome remained intact. The structure did not develop a single crack, not a single deformation. How could a serf with just 2 years of education design a structure that would withstand aerial bombs 130 years after its construction? And now for the most interesting part. Open Wikipedia. Find the article on the Kazan Cathedral in St. Petersburg. Scroll down to the section on the dome. Read carefully. I will quote verbatim. The dome of the Kazan Cathedral consists of 2 rows of iron ribs, both rows anchored at the bottom to a common foundation and gradually diverging towards the top. Additionally, the structure is reinforced with braces and horizontal ribs. A chandelier is suspended from the dome. All of this construction was built before the development of methods for static calculation of frame structures. The dome of the Kazan Cathedral is an example of successful intuitive design. Read the last sentence again. Intuitive design. This is the official explanation. Voronikhin did not calculate the dome. He guessed. He felt it. He intuitively determined where to place each load, what thickness to make the ribs, and how to distribute the weight. Are you serious? Let's take a look at what this dome is, technically. The diameter of the dome is 17 meters. The height from the base to the cross is about 50 meters. The weight of the structure is several hundred tons. It's hard to give an exact figure because no one has weighed it, but it's estimated to be 300 to 400 tons just for the metal elements. The dome consists of 2 rows of ribs, an inner row and an outer row. The ribs are forged iron beams, not cast iron or rolled steel. Specifically, they are wrought iron. Each rib is handcrafted with a hammer in a blacksmith's forge. How many blacksmiths are needed to forge 300 tons of beams? How much time is required? What type of furnaces are needed to heat such volumes of metal? Now about the technology. To forge iron, a temperature of around 1200 degrees is needed. At this temperature, iron becomes pliable. It can be hammered and shaped. However, wrought iron is not steel. It is softer, weaker, and easily deformed under load. Steel is stronger. Steel is made by adding carbon to iron in precisely defined proportions and processing it at specific temperatures. The Bessemer process, a method of producing steel by blowing hot air through molten iron, was invented by Henry Bessemer in 1856. This was 45 years after the completion of the construction of Kazan Cathedral. Until Bessemer, steel was produced using the ancient method of cementation. Iron was kept in coal for a long time, allowing carbon to be absorbed into the metal. The process was slow, expensive, and the quality unstable. Such steel was not used for construction structures. Too costly, too unreliable. So, the dome of the Kazan Cathedral is made of wrought iron, which is weaker than steel. Yet it can withstand its own weight, wind loads, snow, vibrations, and bombings. How is this possible? Only if the structure is designed perfectly. If every edge is positioned exactly where it should be. If the load distribution is adjusted to the millimeter. If all possible deformations, thermal expansions, and metal fatigue are taken into account. Such calculations require knowledge of strength of materials. Strength of materials is the science of how materials behave under load. It is taught in technical universities. To calculate a rod structure, such as a dome, one must solve systems of differential equations. It is necessary to know the elastic moduli of the materials, safety factors, and yield limits. The methods of static analysis for rod structures were developed in the second half of the 19th century by engineers such as Heinrich Müller-Breslau, Carl Kuhlmann, and James Clerk Maxwell. They created a mathematical framework that allows for the calculation of bridges, towers, and domes. But the Kazan Cathedral was built in 1811, before these methods, and Voronikhin, who had 2 years of drawing under Bazhanov, somehow intuitively created what would require higher mathematics 50 years later. Do you believe in this? There are only 2 explanations. First, Voronikhin was a genius on the level of Leonardo da Vinci, a man who was 50 years ahead of his time, a self-taught individual who invented calculation methods that the best engineers in Europe wouldn't reach for another 50 years. And yet, he left behind not a single record, not a single drawing with calculations. Everything was in his mind, intuition. Second, Voronikhin did not design the dome. The dome already existed. Voronikhin's task was different: to restore damaged elements, clean the structure, and reinforce the connections. To repair what others had built. Those who possess technologies that are unknown to us or kept from us. Which explanation is more plausible? And here we come to the person who stands behind Voronikhin, the true client. The one without whom this whole story would be impossible. Alexander Sergeyevich Stroganov. One of the wealthiest individuals in the Russian Empire, owner of salt mines in the Ural region, factories, forest lands, and tens of thousands of serfs. The fortune of the Stroganov family was measured in millions of rubles. For comparison, the construction of the Kazan Cathedral cost the treasury $4.5 million. Stroganov could have built 10 such cathedrals from his personal funds, and it would not have impacted his budget. But money is just the tip of the iceberg. The true power of Stroganov was not financial, but political. In the year 1761, Alexander Sergeyevich received the title of Count of the Holy Roman Empire. Note, not Russian, but Holy Roman. The title was granted by the Austrian emperor. This is not merely an honorary title, it is a political status. A Count of the Holy Roman Empire is a member of the European elite. Admission to a level where the fates of nations are decided. The Russian Count Stroganov became a count only in 1798, during the reign of Paul I. However, he received the title of Austrian Count 37 years earlier. Throughout those 37 years, he remained a subject of the Russian emperor, while bearing the title of the Austrian crown. How does this work? How can one serve one sovereign and be a count of another? In ordinary logic, this is impossible. It is a conflict of interest. The Holy Roman Empire and Russia are competitors. They are at war for influence in Poland, the Baltics, and the Balkans. Their foreign policy interests are opposed. But for a Mason, there are no contradictions. A Mason does not serve the state. He serves the lodge, and the lodge is above the states. Stroganov was a Mason of high degrees. This is no secret. Historians acknowledge it, though they try to downplay its significance. They say that at the time, Masonry was a fashionable pastime. Nobles joined lodges, discussed philosophy, and engaged in charity work. Nothing extraordinary. But Stroganov was not an ordinary member. He held high positions in the Masonic organizations of France and Prussia. He was involved in the creation of the structure known as the Grand Orient of France. This is not a charitable club. It is a political force coordinating the actions of Freemasons across Europe. The Grand East of France controlled appointments to key positions. Lodge members promoted their brothers in governments, armies, banks, and universities. They created a network of influence that operated above the official state structures. And this man, a Mason, a count of 2 empires, returns to Russia and embarks on the construction of the main Orthodox Church of the capital. At first glance, it seems, so what? A wealthy patron wants to gain fame, so he builds a cathedral. That was a normal practice for the time. Rich people donated to churches, received blessings from the clergy, and ensured themselves a good reputation. But pay attention to the details. Stroganov is not just donating money. He personally oversees the project. He selects the architect, his former serf. He approves the design, a copy of a Catholic basilica. He monitors every stage of construction. In fact, the Kazan Cathedral is his personal project from start to finish. And this project has its peculiarities. Open a bird's-eye view of the Kazan Cathedral. Forget about the beauty of the colonnades and the grandeur of the domes. Look at the geometry, at the shape of the building. Latin cross. Elongated, with a long longitudinal axis and a short transverse one. The same shape is found in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, in Cologne Cathedral in Germany, in dozens of Catholic basilicas throughout Europe. This is the form of a Catholic church, a symbol of the Roman Church. Orthodox churches are built differently. The Greek cross has 4 equal ends, or a cross within a square, or a circle, a symbol of eternity, the infinity of God. The elongated Latin cross is not used in Orthodoxy. It is a foreign tradition. But the Kazan Cathedral, the main Orthodox church in St. Petersburg, is built in the shape of a Catholic cross. Coincidence? Architectural fashion? The influence of classicism? Then explain the colonnade. 96 columns of the Corinthian order, arranged in a semicircle, form an open gallery. It is an exact replica of the colonnade of St. Peter's Square in Rome. The very same colonnade designed by Gian Lorenzo Bernini in the 17th century. The same height of the columns, the same proportions, the same radius of curvature, the same function. To create a grand space before the entrance, direct the gaze towards the central portal, and enhance the impression of grandeur. Stroganov allegedly wanted the Kazan Cathedral to resemble St. Peter's Basilica. This is the official version. Emperor Paul I admired Roman architecture and wished to have a likeness of the main Catholic Church in Petersburg. Stroganov fulfilled the emperor's desire. A beautiful legend. But there is a problem. There is no evidence that Voronikhin was in Rome. There are no records of his travels. No letters, diaries, or sketches. The official version states that he studied St. Peter's Basilica through engravings and paintings. By the pictures. Can you imagine copying the most complex architectural structure from a picture? Calculating proportions, angles, curves, and loads, all based on an engraving? This is impossible. A print provides a flat image. It does not show the thickness of the walls, the depth of the niches, or the details of the fastenings. You can't understand from the picture how the column connects to the base, how the weight of the entablature is distributed, or at what angle the arches are inclined. To copy a building, you need blueprints or a personal inspection with measurements. Voronikhin had neither of those. This means he had ready-made blueprints. From where? From Stroganov. But where did Stroganov get it from? He was in Rome many times. He lived in Italy, studied art, interacted with architects. He could have ordered measurements, purchased drawings, hired specialists. But why does an Orthodox patron need the blueprints of a Catholic basilica? To build a similar temple in Russia? Or was it then to disguise the true purpose of the building? Look at the symbolism. The all-seeing eye. A triangle with an eye inside. The main symbol of Freemasonry. It hangs above the entrance to the Kazan Cathedral, on the western side, where the faithful enter the temple. In Orthodox iconography, the all-seeing eye does not exist. There is the image of Christ Pantocrator, the Almighty. There is the depiction of God the Father, but not an abstract eye within a triangle. That is a foreign symbol, borrowed from Kabbalah, from Hermeticism, from occult traditions. In Catholicism, the all-seeing eye is encountered, but rarely. In some Baroque churches, it appears as a symbol of the Trinity. However, even there, it is an exception rather than the rule. In Freemasonry, this is the central symbol, the eye of the great architect of the universe. He who sees all, controls all, knows all. The eye that gazes upon every Mason and reminds them, you are being watched. Your oaths are recorded. Your commitments are remembered. And this symbol hangs in the Orthodox Church. Many will now write, it's just an artistic decision. The architect decorated the facade with a beautiful symbol, nothing special. Well, then explain why this symbol began to appear in mass, specifically after the War of 1812. Look at the buildings constructed or restored after this war. The all-seeing eye is everywhere. On facades, on pediments, on medals, on state seals. Look at the award weapons of that era. Sabers, swords, dirks that were given to officers for their feats. The hilts are engraved with the all-seeing eye. On the medals for the capture of Paris, the all-seeing eye. On the monuments in honor of victory, the all-seeing eye. This is not an artistic trend. It is a signature, a mark of the one who stands behind all these events. The Masonic Lodge is marking its territory, and the Kazan Cathedral is one of those landmarks. What Orthodox church could be referred to if it is being built by a Mason, copying a Catholic basilica, and hanging a Masonic symbol on the facade? This is not an Orthodox church. It is a Masonic lodge disguised as orthodoxy, or a Catholic base repurposed into an Orthodox one. Or it might even be a building of entirely different purpose that has been adapted into a church. But definitely not what is written in the reference books. And now let's go inside. Let's take a look at the columns. Pink Finnish granite. 48 columns, each over 10 meters tall. Solid monoliths, brought from quarries, processed, polished, and installed. A masterpiece of stone carving art. The pride of the cathedral. That's how it's written in the reference books. And now approach any column and take a closer look. If the lighting is good, you will see cracks. Not fine hairline ones, but serious ones. Chips. Places where the top layer has come off and exposed another material underneath. Take a close look at these places. Under the pink layer, there is a white mass. Clearly not granite. Granite does not flake. If a piece of granite chips off, underneath it is still granite, just of a different shade, with a different crystal texture. But here, under the pink layer, is white plaster. Granite columns made of plaster. How is that possible? The most obvious explanation is that the columns are not made of solid granite. They are an imitation, a brick or stone base clad with granite chips or thin plates, covered with a special compound that looks like real stone after polishing. The technology of counterfeiting, known since the times of ancient Rome. When it is necessary to create an impression of luxury, but the real material is too expensive or hard to obtain, imitation is used. But why imitate granite in the main cathedral of the capital? Stroganov has enough money. The quarries in Finland are nearby. There are stone carvers available. If the columns are fake, it means there were never any real ones, or they were damaged and replaced, or the columns were originally made using a different method. Quick, cheap, mass-produced. Take a closer look at the columns of St. Isaac's Cathedral. There's the same issue. Cracks, chips, plaster beneath the visible layer. The columns of the Winter Palace, Mikhailovsky Castle, Smolny Cathedral. Everywhere is imitation. This is not a coincidence. It's a system. All these buildings were constructed or renovated at the same time, following a single standard, using a unified technology for mass production of decorative elements. Real granite is cut over the course of years. One column 10 meters tall can be hewn from a monolith in a year, maybe two, if a team of experienced stonecutters works continuously. 48 columns mean 100 years of work, or 5 years if 1,000 craftsmen are deployed simultaneously. Such masters do not exist in Russia at the beginning of the 19th century. They are nowhere to be found. Stone-cutting artistry of this level requires generations of training. Tools are needed: diamond saws, cutters, abrasives. Infrastructure is necessary: workshops with precise equipment, cooling systems, transport for multi-ton blocks. None of this exists. But the columns remain. So they were made differently, quickly, cheaply. Imitation instead of the original. Or the actual columns were already standing but had been damaged. Cracks, chips, weathering. And they were restored by applying a new layer, filling in the damage. Just like how old frescoes are restored, a new layer of paint is applied over the faded ones. In any case, the columns of the Kazan Cathedral are not what they are made out to be. And now let's exit the cathedral and walk around it from the back, the side that tourists are not taken to, where there are no beautiful viewpoints, where the plaster has peeled away from time and moisture because no one updates it. It's out of sight after all. Look at the walls. Red brick. The facade of the cathedral facing Nevsky Prospect looks like stone. The blocks are tough, a porous rock of volcanic origin. The masonry is even, the joints neat, and the color light, a noble material. But at the back, where the plaster has fallen off, the foundation shows through. Red, burnt brick. Standard size, even rows, uniform joints. Are these two different walls? No, it is one wall. A brick base faced with tuff on the front and plastered at the back. Okay, let's assume this is normal construction practice. The front facade is made of expensive material, while the back side, which isn't visible, is made of cheap material. Savings. A sensible approach. But then why is the brick red? To produce red brick, clay must be fired at a temperature of about 1,100 degrees. At this temperature, the iron oxide present in the clay oxidizes and gives a red color. If fired at a lower temperature, the brick will be yellow or brown. If at a higher temperature, it will turn black. 1,100 degrees is a blast furnace. This is industrial production. High-quality coal or coke is needed for fuel. Precise temperature regulation is essential. The loading and unloading of hundreds of bricks simultaneously is required. At the beginning of the 19th century, there were few such productions in Russia. Bricks were mainly made in a cottage industry. They were fired in pits or primitive kilns. The quality was unstable and the color uneven. But the brick of the Kazan Cathedral is perfectly uniform, identical in size, color, and density. This is factory production, mass-produced and standardized. And the same kind of brick in St. Isaac's Cathedral, in the Mikhailovsky Castle, in the Winter Palace, in Smolny Cathedral, in all the old buildings of Petersburg. It goes on. Look at the old buildings of Europe: London, Paris, Berlin, Amsterdam, Prague. Everywhere you see red brick, all the same size, all the same firing, all the same masonry, around the world. Too even. It was as if there was a single factory supplying bricks to all continents, or a single civilization building according to a unified standard. Red brick is a signature, a distinguishing mark of the system that built these buildings, a system that existed before the catastrophe, before the division of the world into separate states with different technologies. After the catastrophe, the new owners are trying to conceal the red brick. They plaster it, veneer it, paint over it, to make the buildings look new, recently built, in the local style. But time cannot be deceived. The plaster is crumbling, and the brick is showing through. A silent testament to the fact that these buildings were not built by those who currently live in them. And now, the most terrifying part. What has disappeared from the square in front of the cathedral? Open the old engravings and paintings of the Kazan Cathedral. There are many of them. Artists loved this view. Grand, ceremonial, with a colonnade and dome. In the center of all these images stands an obelisk in the square. Tall, pointed, made of dark stone, granite or basalt. A typical Egyptian obelisk is a four-sided column, tapering towards the top, ending with a pyramidal apex. He rises above the crowd. He serves as a landmark. He dominates the composition of the square. Every artist, without exception, paints him. This means he was there, in reality. He wasn't an artistic fiction. And now, step out onto Kazan Square. There is no obelisk. Instead, there is an empty space. Cobblestones, flower beds, benches. No traces of the multi-ton monument that once stood there. When did he disappear? Why? Where did they put him? In guidebooks, there are no words. In reference books, silence. In encyclopedias, the Kazan Cathedral is described in terms of its colonnade, dome, icons, services, and restorations, but nothing about the obelisk, as if it had never existed. This is a lie, as if the artists made everything up. But the artists didn't make it up. They had no reason to paint a non-existent obelisk. They were capturing reality. And the obelisk existed. Similar obelisks stand all around the world. The most famous one is in St. Peter's Square in the Vatican. It's an Egyptian obelisk brought by Emperor Caligula almost 2,000 years ago. It stands 25 meters tall and weighs 330 tons. It is positioned at the center of the square in front of the cathedral, serving as the visual axis of the entire composition. Obelisks in Paris. The Luxor obelisk at the Place de la Concorde. Its height is 23 meters, and it weighs 250 tons. It was brought from Egypt in 1836. The obelisk in London. Cleopatra's Needle on the banks of the Thames. 21 meters, 224 tons. Delivered in 1878. The obelisk in Washington. The Washington Monument. The tallest, 170 meters. Built in the late 19th century after the model of the Egyptians. Obelisks in Istanbul, Rome, New York. Everywhere. These are not decorations. They are elements of the system. Obelisk, antenna. Its shape is specially designed to work with the electromagnetic field. The tip at the top concentrates the charge. If the obelisk is made of granite or basalt, these rocks contain quartz, which has piezoelectric properties. When subjected to mechanical stress, quartz generates an electrical potential. Gravity presses down on the obelisk. The wind creates vibrations. Temperature fluctuations cause the material to expand and contract. All of this creates mechanical stresses in the quartz crystals. Quartz generates a weak electric current, weak for our understanding. But if the entire planet is covered with a network of such obelisks, and they are tuned to a single frequency, the system begins to function as a singular resonator. Add the domes of cathedrals to this. A dome is also an antenna, but of a different type. It operates on the resonance of air vibrations. Inside the dome, a standing wave of a specific frequency is created. If the dome is metallic, it amplifies this wave. Now imagine this: an obelisk in the square in front of the cathedral, the dome above the cathedral. The colonnade between them is not just decoration, but a part of the resonator. 96 columns create an interference pattern, focusing energy. Under the cathedral, there are underground passages connected to the river. Water serves as a conductor and stabilizer. It cools the system, dissipates excess energy, and creates grounding. The entire structure functions as a converter. It captures energy from the surrounding environment, atmospheric electricity, geomagnetic fields, vibrations of the earth. It transforms this energy into a usable form and distributes it throughout the buildings via an underground network. Free energy. No wires, no fuel, no meters. That is why, after the catastrophe, the new rulers dismantled the obelisks. The system stopped functioning, and the obelisks turned into useless monuments. But they cannot be left as they are. Someone might figure out what they were for, understand the principle, and restore the technology. That's why the obelisks are removed, quietly, without announcements. One day, they're simply gone. And if anyone asks, they'll say it disrupted traffic, or it had fallen into disrepair, or that it was never there. It was just a figment of the artist's imagination. And in 100 years, no one will remember that there was an obelisk in front of the Kazan Cathedral. In the same way, they wiped away the memory of who actually built the cathedral and about what it was built for. Now the final piece of evidence, the one that completely undermines the official version. The grave of Kutuzov. Enter the Kazan Cathedral. Turn left from the entrance. In the northern chapel, behind a massive bronze grille, you will see a tombstone. Black marble, gilded letters, bas-reliefs, Here lies Mikhail Illarionovich Golenishev Kutuzov, Commander-in-Chief of the Russian Army in the War of 1812, victor over Napoleon, savior of the homeland. The official version tells us a heroic story, a wise commander who lured the French into a trap, patiently retreated, exhausting the enemy, waited for General Winter, brought Napoleon's army to complete destruction, freed Russia, became a national hero. He died in the year 1813 in the city of Bunzlau in Prussia. His body was embalmed, brought to St. Petersburg, and buried with honors in the Kazan Cathedral. Remember this version. Now look at the symbols. Step closer to the tombstone. Examine the bas-reliefs. To the left and right of the central inscription are two large medallions. On one medallion is depicted a pyramid, cut off with a flat top. Above the pyramid hovers a triangle with an eye inside, the all-seeing eye, a classic Masonic symbol. On the second medallion is a solar disk with rays, a solar symbol that is not used in Christian tradition. It represents ancient cults, Mithras, Ra, Helios, the worship of the luminary. Between the medallions are palm branches, torches, and laurel wreaths. Roman symbolism of triumph and dedication. Not a single cross, not a single icon, not a single Christian symbol. On the tombstone of the Orthodox commander, buried with ecclesiastical honors in an Orthodox cathedral. The most obvious explanation is that Kutuzov was a Mason. Historians do not hide this. Yes, he was. He belonged to a lodge. But officially in the lower degrees, he did not play a significant role in the movement. Okay, let's say. But then why did the Orthodox Church allow a Mason to be buried in the main cathedral of the capital? Why did it permit Masonic symbols on the gravestone? Why did it not object to the all-seeing eye and sun discs? Masonry and orthodoxy are incompatible. The Church officially anathematized Freemasons. It prohibited them from receiving communion, participating in sacraments, and being buried in consecrated ground. A Mason, even one who repented, remained under suspicion for the rest of their life. Here, he's not just a Mason. They are burying him like a saint. In the center of the cathedral, with Masonic symbols on the grave. That doesn't add up, unless the Church was Orthodox. Look at the entire cathedral as a whole. Walk through the nave. Raise your head to the dome. Look around you. On the western wall, above the main entrance, in a round medallion, an all-seeing eye. A triangle with an eye. Just like the one on Kutuzov's tomb, only bigger, about 1.5 meters in diameter. It is integrated into the architecture. It was not drawn later, nor added during restoration. It is part of the original design. The all-seeing eye is the main symbol of the Kazan Cathedral. In the Orthodox tradition, this symbol is called the Eye of Providence. It is rarely encountered. Typically found on icons of the Holy Trinity, where the triangle symbolizes the unity of God. However, it is not placed on the walls of churches. This is not customary. In Freemasonry, the all-seeing eye is a central symbol. It represents the great architect of the universe, the divine mind that created the world according to the laws of geometry and numbers. Freemasons depict the eye on lodges, aprons, seals, and medals. It serves as their identifying mark. And this sign has been hanging on the wall of the Kazan Cathedral since the moment it was built. The official version claims that the symbol ended up there by accident. They say that the architect, Voronikhin, who was trained in European art, borrowed a fashionable motif without understanding its Masonic significance. The naive serf simply copied a beautiful image. But Voronikhin worked under the guidance of Stroganov. Stroganov is a high-degree Mason, Great East of France. He knew exactly what the all-seeing eye meant, and he allowed it to be placed on the wall of the main Orthodox Church on Nevsky Prospect. Moreover, he insisted on it, because the cathedral was not built for Orthodox Christians. It was built for the lodge, for the brotherhood, for those who understand symbols. Kazan Cathedral is a Masonic temple, disguised as an Orthodox one. Now look at the building plan. You already know it has the shape of a Latin cross, elongated with a long central axis and short lateral chapels. Just like St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Orthodox churches are built in the shape of a Greek cross, of equal arms, or in the shape of a ship, an elongated rectangle. The Latin cross is a Catholic tradition, but the Kazan Cathedral is not Catholic. It is an Orthodox church, with Russian icons, Old Church Slavonic services, and Orthodox clergy. Why is the plan Catholic then? Because the plan is neither Orthodox nor Catholic. It is Masonic. The Latin cross with an elongated axis is a schematic representation of the movement of energy, from west to east, from the profane world to the sacred altar, the path of initiation, a gradual approach to the center where the great mystery resides. The colonnade around the cathedral consists of 96 columns. This number is not accidental. 96 is 12 multiplied by 8. 12 represents the number of apostles, months, and zodiac signs. 8 signifies new beginnings, resurrection, and transition to a new quality. Multiply 12 by 8. You will get 96. Completed cycle. Full transformation. The colonnade is not a fence. It is a boundary between two worlds, between ordinary life and sacred space. To enter the cathedral, one must pass through the columns, symbolically crossing the threshold. Inside the cathedral, light, huge windows, high vaults, bright marble. Everything creates a sense of spaciousness, airiness, weightlessness. This is an intentional effect, to make a person feel that they have risen above the ordinary, entered a higher reality. Orthodox churches are built differently. Dim light, narrow windows, heavy arches. A person must feel the weight of sin, the pressure of the earthly world. And only before the iconostasis, where candles burn, does light burst forth, a symbol of divine grace. In the Kazan Cathedral, everything is the opposite. Light is everywhere. The cathedral is flooded with it, as if it were not a temple, but an ancient basilica or Roman forum, because that is what a forum is, a place for gatherings, a place where the initiated meet. Now let's return to Kutuzov, to the War of 1812, to what actually happened. The official story speaks of an invasion. Napoleon, having assembled a 600,000-strong army, crosses the border into Russia. He marches towards Moscow. The Russians retreat. Kutuzov engages in a major battle at Borodino, but cannot stop the French. He abandons Moscow. Napoleon enters the burned city. He realizes he cannot winter in the ruins. He begins to retreat. He falls under attacks from Cossacks, partisans, and the frost. He loses his army. He flees back to France. Russia triumphs. Kutuzov becomes a national hero. He is granted the title of Most Serene Prince of Smolensk. He sets off to liberate Europe. He dies en route. He is buried in the Kazan Cathedral as the savior of the homeland. A beautiful story, patriotic, yet it does not explain the main thing. Why did Napoleon march on Moscow instead of St. Petersburg? Petersburg is the capital. There Emperor Alexander resides. There is the court, the government, the treasury. Capturing Petersburg would mean the end of the war. Alexander would capitulate. Russia would accept Napoleon's terms. But Napoleon ignores Petersburg. He marches on Moscow, the old capital that has lost its political significance, a city of merchants, nobility, and churches. Why? A skeptic would say, to impose peace, to capture the heart of Russia, to force Alexander to surrender. But Alexander had no intention of surrendering. He sat in Petersburg, calmly observing the advance of the French. He didn't panic, didn't flee, didn't propose peace. As if he knew that Moscow would be surrendered, that it would be burned, that Napoleon would leave with nothing. As if it was the plan. A plan in which Kutuzov and Napoleon each played their role. Look at the medals from that war, from the Russians and the French. On many of them, you will see something strange. The profiles of Napoleon and Alexander side by side, as co-rulers, as brothers in arms. Why are the enemies depicted together? Because they were not enemies. They were executors of one command, the command of the Lodge. Their task is to destroy Moscow, the city that still held the memory of the old world, of the civilization that existed before the catastrophe. Napoleon comes from the west. Kutuzov retreats from the east. The city remains empty. It is set ablaze. The fire destroys the wooden structures. But the most important thing is that the fire conceals the traces of another weapon. Look at the stones of the Moscow cathedrals after the fire. They bear strange traces. Melting, sintering, changes in structure. This is only possible at temperatures above 1500 degrees. Wooden houses do not burn that hot. Even kerosene and oil do not produce such temperatures. What can melt stone? Termite charges, phosphorus bombs, directed energy. Technologies that officially emerged in the 20th century. However, traces of their application can be seen in the 19th century. Moscow was not just burned, it was sterilized. Everything that could tell the truth about the past was destroyed. Libraries, archives, chronicles, maps, everything burned down. Officially, it was an accident. Riots, looters, fires. In reality, it's a cleanup. After the fire, Moscow was rebuilt anew, in just a few years, with incredible speed. Where did the resources come from? Where did the bricks come from if the factories burned down? Where did the laborers come from if the men died in the war? The answer is simple. They didn't build, they dug up. Moscow was buried under clay. The first floors of buildings disappeared underground, just like in Petersburg, just like in Paris, just like everywhere. After the war, A great restoration begins. They excavate the surviving buildings. They plaster the walls. They change the signs. They announce it as a new construction. And that which is too damaged is finally covered up. A cultural layer is created. 3-4 meters of soil. And they say, this has accumulated over 100 years. But the soil doesn't accumulate on its own. It's brought in, deliberately, to cover up the traces. Kutuzov led this operation. Not the victory over Napoleon. The operation to cleanse Moscow. That is precisely why he is buried in the Kazan Cathedral. With honors, with Masonic symbols. He completed his mission. He destroyed the last stronghold of the old world. And his grave is a reminder, for those who understand. Here lies the executor of the lodge's will, a man who sacrificed millions for the establishment of a new order. The all-seeing eye above his grave gazes at visitors. It sees everything. It knows everything. It remembers everything. And it is silent. Now the final step. Let's combine all the clues. The Kazan Cathedral stood until the beginning of the 19th century. It was built by a civilization that possessed technologies we still do not understand. A dome made of wrought iron without calculations, columns imitating granite, red brick of a uniform standard. Next to the cathedral stood an obelisk, a part of the energy system. The system was operational. It provided free energy, heated buildings, powered technologies. Then a disaster happened, a global one. Cities were buried in clay. The first floors disappeared underground. The system stopped working. The survivors, or newcomers, occupied the remaining buildings, not understanding how they work, not knowing who built them. At the beginning of the 19th century, legalization began. Buildings were given a history. Architects were appointed. Fictitious construction took place. Grand openings were held. They were written into a new chronology. The Kazan Cathedral was named after Voronikhin, a serf whose biography is impossible to verify. Zemtsov's church was transformed into a predecessor. It was called Modest, so that the new cathedral would appear more majestic. The Freemasons have placed their signs, the all-seeing eye, the Latin cross, the symbols of Stroganov, to mark that the building now belongs to the lodge. The obelisk has been dismantled. The system has been permanently shut down. The traces have been erased. Kutuzov was buried in the cathedral as the hero of the operation to destroy Moscow, the last bastion of resistance against the old world. And all of this was wrapped in a beautiful legend about war, about victory, about patriotism, about a national hero, so that no one would guess that the war was a ritual, a sacrifice, a way to erase the memory of who we really are. You stand in front of the Kazan Cathedral. You look at the colonnade, at the dome, at the facade made of tuff and the brick hidden under the plaster. This is not a temple. This is a trophy. The building that we took from those who built it, renamed it, reconsecrated it, filled it with our priests, hung our icons, held our services. But the building remembers. It was constructed according to different laws, for different purposes, by different people. Its proportions are not orthodox. Its acoustics are not designed for prayers. Its dome does not rely on faith. It is supported by engineering calculations that we cannot replicate. We live in chuzhich houses. We pray in chuzhich temples. We walk on chuzhich streets, and we call it our story. The Kazan Cathedral is one of thousands of pieces of evidence. Look at the demographic data of Petersburg in the early 19th century. In 1811, the city's population was 350,000 people. Of them, the maximum number of skilled masons capable of laying columns and vaults was 3,000. At the same time, the Kazan Cathedral, the Mining Institute, the Exchange, the Admiralty, and dozens of palaces are under construction. Calculate the volume of work. 3,000 people physically could not complete even 1/10 of it in 10 years. So, most of the buildings were already there. They were refurbished, attributed to the necessary architect, integrated into the new timeline. Such buildings are abundant in Petersburg. They fill Moscow. They fill all of Russia. They fill the whole world. St. Isaac's Cathedral, the Winter Palace, the Hermitage, Smolny, Peter and Paul Fortress, all made of the same red brick beneath the plaster, all with their first floors buried, all with impossible construction technologies. We are told that our ancestors built this, serfs, craftsmen, stonemasons, by hand, over several years. We nod. We take pride. We admire the talent of our ancestors. But if you've ever held a hammer in your hands, if you've tried to build a straight wall from bricks, if you understand how much time even a simple job takes, you know that this is a lie. No one builds a dome out of wrought iron without calculations. No one creates a colonnade system of 96 elements by mere intuition. No one clad an entire building in granite and then covers it with plaster. These are the traces of another civilization, more advanced, more intelligent, more free. A civilization that disappeared, suddenly, catastrophically. And we occupied her house. We wore her clothes. We took on her name. And now we pretend that we've always lived here. The Kazan Cathedral stands on Nevsky Prospect. Tourists are taking photos of the colonnade. The faithful come in to light a candle. Tour guides tell stories about Voronikhin and the War of 1812. No one asks where the red brick comes from. No one searches for the obelisk in old paintings. No one counts the time it took to build the dome. The all-seeing eye watches from the wall. It sees silence. It sees oblivion. It sees how generation after generation accepts lies as truth. And he remains silent, because for those who placed him there, this silence is profitable. They won. They took the planet. They rewrote history. They made us believe that we are the descendants of savages who learned to build palaces in 200 years. The truth is simple and frightening. Open the construction estimates. Kazan Cathedral, 4,700,000 rubles. St. Isaac's Cathedral, 23 million. The Winter Palace after the fire, 15 million. These amounts are colossal for the early 19th century. The budget of the entire Russian Empire was 200 million rubles a year. This means that just for these 3 buildings, 1/5 of the annual budget was spent. Meanwhile, hundreds of others were being built. The empire was at war. It maintained an army. It paid officials. Where did the money come from? The answer is simple. Money wasn't spent on construction. It was spent on legalization, on bribing for documents, on salaries for phantom architects, on cosmetic renovations of buildings that were already standing. We are the second wave, settlers, the scavengers of civilization. And as long as we do not acknowledge this, we will live in the captivity of someone else's story. Kazan Cathedral, a key, one of many, a building that screams the truth, with every column, every brick, every symbol. You just need to learn to listen. And then you will not see a temple. You will see a message from those who came before us, who built this world, who possessed the technologies of free energy, who lived without wars, without poverty, without slavery, who has vanished, leaving us ruins and silence. And we turned ruins into museums, and we named silence history. But let's break down this operation step by step. How exactly did they transform the ancient cathedral into a new building from the 19th century? How did they create the legend? How did they make us believe? The scheme is simple. 5 stages. It repeats all over the world, for all the major buildings that we consider to be ours. Stage 1. Catastrophe. Planetary. Global. Annihilating civilization or weakening it to a critical level. A flood of clay. A shift of the poles. The fall of a comet. The cause doesn't matter. What matters is the result. The city is falling asleep. The first floors sink underground. Energy systems cease to function. Obelisks lose their connection with the domes. Water in the basements floods the communications. The population perishes or disperses. Buildings remain, strong, designed to last for centuries, but empty, without owners, without purpose. Stage 2. Settlement. Survivors or newcomers find buildings. They do not understand who built them. They do not know how they worked. They see simply a sturdy shelter, a place to wait out the cold, hide from enemies, and organize life. They are settling in. They occupy the upper floors. The lower ones are buried. They are making doors from windows. They light fires in the middle of the hall because they don't understand how to turn on the heating. They damage the interiors, break unfamiliar mechanisms, and use the debris as building materials. They live. They reproduce. They forget that the building was not constructed by them. Stage 3. Legalization. Several generations pass. New owners get settled. They start asking questions. Who built this building? When? Why? And here come those who orchestrated the disaster, or those who benefited from it. The lodges, the royal houses, the bankers, the new elite. They say, "We built. Our ancestors, our craftsmen. Here is the architect. Here are the dates. Here is the budget. Here is the monarch's decree." Documents are fabricated. Blueprints are drawn retroactively. Chronicles are rewritten. The architect is given a biography, preferably vague so it can't be verified. A serf without an education. A self-taught genius. A foreigner who died young. Anyone will do, as long as there are no living witnesses. And the building officially becomes a new construction. It is dated to the century that the authorities require. It fits into the timeline. Stage 4. Symbolic appropriation. Legalization is not enough. The building needs to be marked. Show who it now belongs to. They add their own symbols. The all-seeing eye. Masonic symbols. Crests of new dynasties. Crosses if the building is turned into a church. Flags if it is made into a palace. They are removing old symbols. They are chipping away at bas-reliefs. They are covering up frescoes. They are melting down bells. They are renaming streets and squares. They erase the memory of what was before them. And the building becomes not just a structure. It becomes a manifesto, a declaration of power, evidence that the new masters are the rightful heirs of a great past, although in reality they are usurpers, settlers, imposters. Stage 5. Information blockade. Final. The most important. They are creating a system in which asking questions becomes inappropriate, dangerous, foolish. If someone says that the building is too complex for its time, they are told, "You underestimate our ancestors. They were brilliant." If someone says the construction deadlines are unrealistic, they are told, "They had many workers." Enthusiasm, faith. If someone says that technology is out of sync with the times, they are told, "You are not an expert. You don't understand. Trust the scientists." An army of defenders of the official version is being created. Historians, architects, archaeologists, tour guides, teachers, journalists. They all sincerely believe in what they tell, because they were taught from textbooks written by the victors, because their careers depend on whether they repeat the approved version. Dissenters are labeled as conspiracy theorists, dreamers, ignorant. They are isolated, ridiculed, deprived of access to an audience. And after 150 years, lies become the truth, because all those who remembered the truth have died, and new generations know only what they were taught in school. This scheme works flawlessly all around the world. The Kazan Cathedral has gone through all 5 stages, just like thousands of other buildings. A catastrophe in the early 19th century, or perhaps even earlier. The burial of cities in clay. The collapse of energy systems. Occupation of surviving buildings by survivors or newcomers. Using them without understanding their function. Legalization through fictitious construction. Appointment of Voronikhin as architect. Dates: 1801 to 1811. Symbolic appropriation. The all-seeing eye. Kutuzov's grave. Masonic symbols. Cleaning the obelisk. Information blockade. Any criticism of the official version is labeled as nonsense. Dissenters are isolated. The result is that you stand before the cathedral and believe that it was built by a serf in 10 years, without education, without calculations, on intuition. Do you believe that the wrought iron dome was made before the invention of steel? Do you believe that the colonnade, made up of 96 elements, was built by eye? Do you believe that a church with a ceiling height of 15 meters was called modest? Do you believe that the Orthodox Church was built in the shape of a Catholic cross by mistake? Do you believe that the obelisk disappeared from the square because it was obstructive? You believe because you have been convinced, systematically, methodically, for 200 years. But the system fails, because a building is not paper. It can't be rewritten. It can be plastered over, but the brick will show through. It can be masked, but the proportions will remain. One can invent a legend, but the facts will contradict. And if you start to pay close attention, to compare, to count, to ask uncomfortable questions, you will see cracks in the official version. 1, 2, 10, and the entire structure will start to collapse. Kazan Cathedral is not the only building of its kind. It is just one example among thousands. St. Isaac's Cathedral, allegedly built by Montferrand over 40 years. Columns weighing 100 tons each. A dome made of metal. Frescoes, mosaics, stucco. And yet Montferrand was a French architect who, before arriving in Russia, only built wooden houses. Do you believe it? The Winter Palace, reconstructed after the fire of 1837 in just 1 year. 1,500 rooms, parquet floors, moldings, frescoes, in 1 year, under the conditions of a Russian winter, without modern tools. Do you believe it? Peter and Paul Fortress, allegedly founded by Peter the Great in 1703, on a swamp, without a foundation. Walls 12 meters high made of brick. A spire 120 meters tall, built in just a few years. Do you believe it? Smolny Cathedral, Rastrelli, 5 domes, a highly complex architecture. It took 20 years to build, allegedly. But inside, the cathedral is empty, without decoration, without frescoes, just walls, as if it were not built but found unfinished. The Hermitage, a collection of 3 million exhibits, paintings, sculptures, jewelry, coins, allegedly gathered by Catherine the Great over 30 years of reign. 3 million items. Even if one were to buy 100 items a day without any days off, a lifetime wouldn't be enough. Where did this collection come from? It was found in a building that had already stood there, across all of Russia, across the entire world. The same story. Majestic buildings, impossible construction deadlines, ghost architects, technologies ahead of their time. Look at the tools of that era. In the early 19th century, stonemasons worked with chisels and hammers. The cranes were wooden blocks with ropes. The maximum lifting height was 5 meters. To raise the column of St. Isaac's to 40 meters, a system of compound pulleys would be needed. However, there is no evidence of such systems in the engravings. The columns stand as if they were not lifted, but grew in place by themselves. After the catastrophe, after the Great Purge, the civilization that possessed these technologies disappeared. Suddenly, completely. We came to the ashes. We inhabited the ruins. We claimed the legacy. And they called themselves builders. The Kazan Cathedral is silent. It cannot tell who actually built it, but it shows. It shows a red brick under the plaster. It shows a dome that could not have been created in the early 19th century. It shows columns with cracks imitating granite. It shows an all-seeing eye on the wall. It shows the plan of a Catholic cross in an Orthodox church. It reveals the truth, for those who are ready to see it. Are you ready? Are you ready to admit that the story you were told is a lie? Are you ready to admit that your ancestors didn't build palaces, but inhabited others? Are you ready to acknowledge that a great civilization perished not long ago, and that we, are living among its remnants? If so, start watching closely on the buildings around you, on their proportions, on the materials, on the technologies, on the buried first floors, on the windows that look into the ground, on the red brick beneath the peeling plaster, on the obelisks that have vanished from the squares, on the symbols that do not align with the official version, on the dates that do not match the possibilities of the era. Look, compare, count, ask questions, and you will see that the Kazan Cathedral is just the beginning, that our entire history is a facade, fabricated 2 centuries ago to hide the greatest crime, genocide of a civilization, appropriation of its legacy, enslavement of its descendants. We were forced to forget who we are, where we came from, what we were capable of. They made us believe that we descended from savages, that we evolved slowly, that we achieved progress, although in reality, we have degenerated. We have lost technologies. We have lost knowledge. We have become impoverished. And we live in houses that we do not know how to build. We pray in temples that we do not understand. We walk the streets whose names have deceived us. The Kazan Cathedral stands on Nevsky Prospect, silent, waiting for someone to ask the right questions. They'll look at the dome and say, "This is impossible." They'll look at the all-seeing eye and say, "This is not an orthodox symbol." They'll look at the red brick and say, "Where did it come from?" And when there are enough such people, when they stop believing the official version, then the building will speak. It will tell its true story, the story of the civilization that built it, the story of the catastrophe that destroyed it, the story of the settlers who claimed the legacy, our story, the original. Subscribe to the channel and don't forget to hit the bell icon so you won't miss new investigations. There are many more mysteries and discoveries ahead. We will continue to seek evidence, ask uncomfortable questions, and explore what official science overlooks. Because the truth is always nearby. You just need to want to see it.